Hey guys, I don't have to tell you that budgets are tight these days. Some of us don't have enough money to pay attention. So when we say we're building a big block motor today on a budget, we're talking down and dirty cheap. But first, we've got a long-awaited power payoff for our Turbo Mustang here. We're gonna see how its power at the flywheel compares to power at the rear wheels. Weeks ago, we dived into a project we called the Turbo Stang, a 382 cubic inch small block beefed up with a turbo kit from Hellion. It made 1,100 horsepower at the flywheel on race gas, almost $1,000 on 93 octane premium. Well, later we built a complete roll cage. Then we followed that up with tin work to close up the cockpit. We reinforced the subframes and replaced the floorboards. We bolted up a QA1 system up front that included a tubular K-member, control arms, and coilover conversion kit. We gave it a Pro Street brake kit, along with a front engine plate that let us bolt the motor right onto the subframe.
Last week, we installed the fuel delivery system, from the tank to the fuel pump and filters up to the motor. We installed a new trick dash loaded with gauges and assembled the lightweight steering setup, including, of course, a new wheel. Yeah, that looks good. Next was the radiator with a low-profile fan. Then we relocated the battery out back and installed a kill switch. The rest of the drivetrain, including the power glide and drive shaft, and a performance shifter, before its first time fire up inside the car. Now it's time to see what this thing's got at the rear wheels, where it really counts. Because of parasitic losses in the drivetrain, horsepower measured at the rear wheels is generally 15 to 20% less than the horsepower measured at the flywheel. Now on our first run, we're going to take it easy with a mild first gear pull and make sure we're not going to tear anything up. How hard she twisted, I thought she was rolling off for a second.
That was fast.
Here we go.
We'll do one in a second.
Do one in high gear.
All right.
Did you ever wonder what 24 pounds of boost looks like? Want to see it again? This was a problem on the dyno too. This thing makes so much boost. Once you get it all plumbed up, you can actually take these off, get it welded together and put in, and just have one or two of your access points so you can pull it apart. V-band clamps work real well too. Well, after a quick fix, our third run confirmed our suspicions. The low rear end gearing won't let the current converter spin fast enough to lock up. That's why they call it test and tune.
Well, no reason pushing this thing any harder today. In a few weeks, however, we will take this thing out for the ultimate workout at a local drag strip. Meanwhile, a complete turnaround coming up as we build a blue oval big block without going in the red.
Here it is, the Junkyard starting point of a budget engine build. Now what is it? Well, it's a 385 series engine, which was Ford's last attempt at a production big block.
There were 3 engines in the 385 series. The 429 got the most attention and the most use in factory muscle cars. This would be a nest. Nobody's home. While 460s were planted in a few performance cars, most of those found homes in heavier cars like T-Birds, Mercurys, and Lincolns.
Man, I'm pretty surprised there's not a lot of wear on top of the valves either, where the rocker arm's been running on it.
There it went ahead. Because of their long production run from 68 to 96, well-worn 460 motors are plentiful and pretty cheap compared to Ford FEs.
Here we go.
We found this one for $200 at a local boneyard.
Oh, that's nice.
460s are well known for their stout bottom ends, parts are plentiful, and despite that lackluster image, these motors are capable of making massive torque and plenty of power. Here's a little known fact, the fabled FE motor can only be stroked to 454 cubic inches, while the 460 can be stroked up to 550. All that makes the 460 block a favorite foundation for drag racing.
It's got some grooves in it too. I think the crank can be cleaned up with just polish.
During an engine teardown, you can learn a lot about how an engine ran and how well it was treated. For example, hammered rod bearings are signs of hard use and abuse. No matter what they told you when you bought your old motor, you never know the real story till you get inside.
Stock bore.
Even a budget motor build involves a trip to the machine shop, and even good blocks will need a little work. Now, if you're reusing the crank like us, you'll probably need to have the journals polished. But you can save money by doing some of the work yourself, like reconditioning reusable rods. Our bill at the machine shop, which included reconditioning these iron heads, was about $500, kind of what we expected. So we're reusing everything here, including the rods we pre-assembled. So everything over here is either a factory replacement or came from comp cams for about $800. So with the block, the machining, and the parts, so far we're at $1,500, not too shabby.
We also painted the block ourselves to save a few extra bucks. Now we're gonna go ahead and install some freeze plugs. Now here's a little tip. I see a lot of people just drop these into place and press them in. Well, that can cause water seepage. So we're gonna use a little Loctite retaining compound, which will take care of that leak. Now using a socket slightly smaller than the freeze plug, tap it into place. It's also a good idea to tap the head bolt holes to make sure they're clean. Otherwise, machining material trapped inside could cause a problem when you torque the heads down, just like ours.
Now here's how you can do a little detective work and tell a little bit about when your motor was made and what it was made for, all thanks to this casting number. Now ours is a D9TE-AB. The D9 we learned stands for 1979 or later. The T means it was made for a truck, and the E stands for the Ford Engineering Group. The AB just means there was one revision to the casting.
Now we can drop in the upper half of the rear main seal. Now make sure that the larger side of the sealing lip is towards the front of the engine.
Now since we only had to polish our crank's journals, we can get by with standard size bearings like these stock replacements we got from down the street at O'Reilly. With the usual dab of silicone on the seal ends and some oil on the bearings, we're ready for that crank. Hey, here's something for your Ford buddies who are trivia freaks. The 385 series gets its name from the crank stroke of this motor, 3.85. All right, now the original main caps can go on, with the arrows pointing to the front of the motor, of course.
And we'll keep them in place with factory replacement bolts that we torque to 90 foot-pounds in a crisscross pattern from the center out.
The factory replacement pistons going in here are cast, of course. Good for about 6,000 RPMs and will handle plenty of horsepower.
Yeah, now we're gonna get ready to drop the rod and piston in, and I already oiled up the rings and put lube on the bottom of the bearing. Joe, I think we're ready to pound it home. Awesome.
All right, with that, we now have ourselves a fresh 460 short block that's solid and also pretty cheap.
Yeah, it turns over nice too.
Yeah.
Hey, we'll show you how we finish up the bottom end and the parts we're gonna use up top on our budget big block when we come back. We're back with more of our big block budget buildup. Now our reconditioned heads are almost ready to go back onto the short block, but before we do that, I wanna show you something. Now when you hear somebody talking about valve lapping, here's what they mean. When a valve is lapped, compound is used between the face of the valve and the head. Then it's spun. What this does is it gives it a perfectly consistent circle around the face of the valve. What this boils down to is a perfectly good seal when the valve is shut and no loss of compression. Here's a stock spring, and here's one of the new ones we got from Comp Cams. Now it's a little bit taller and it has a higher spring rate, and check this out. Down inside there's a dampener, and that keeps the spring from wobbling at higher RPMs.
Now, in case you're keeping score, the specs on the valves of these stock heads measure out at 206 on the intake, 165 on the exhaust side. We can also tell you that the combustion chambers measure 88 cc's, and since they're cast iron, they are ridiculously heavy. Velcro gaskets on a budget build, you bet. Don't cut corners here unless you want to blow a head gasket. Now you should always torque your heads from the center out in 3 increments, in our case from 80 to 142 foot-pounds. Also, whatever you do, don't forget to install the head dowels at each end of the block. They're absolutely necessary to properly locate the heads. Our new cam's a Comp hydraulic flat tappet with a 494 gross valve lift on both intake and exhaust. Now, since it is a flat tappet, Got to lube up every one of these lobes. Now, this thing has a broad power band, and for you guys that love to hear them dance, you got a very noticeable idle.
The timing chain's another thing you need to replace. Ours is a stock replacement, installed dot to dot.
Oh, we are using the old cam bolt, though, torqued to 45 foot-pounds. Then the comp hydraulic flat tappet lifters can go in, and they need lots of lube to help break in that cam. Then our stock replacement push rods, and finally the stamped rocker arms. Okay, now for the induction on our big block. This original cast iron intake manifold is not only heavy, comes up way short in the plenum volume department. Now our YN replacement's lightweight aluminum, 37 pounds lighter, and the extra volume, well, it's going to add up to a broad power band from 1,500 to 6,000 RPMs. With the usual bead of silicone laid down on the ends of the block and new gaskets in place, we can drop on the intake. And this you want to get right the first time. Looks like we did. These bolts, by the way, have a torque spec of 25 foot-pounds.
Our 460 big block came with an old points type distributor. We could replace it with a new high dollar piece, but instead we're going to save about 130 bucks with a little upgrade from Pertronics. First, we remove the points, condenser, and grommet. Then clean out any dirt or oil between the breaker plate and cam. Next, we can install the igniter module and place the magnet sleeve onto the distributor shaft. Now we can insert the black and red wires with the new grommet through the housing. Finally, we set the air gap between the module and magnet sleeve using the provided 30 thousandths feeler gauge.
Now what you don't want to do is fire off a distributor like this with a newer HEI coil because you'd melt the module. Pertronics recommends something like this flamethrower that's rated at 1.5 ohms with 40,000 volts, which is just right for this application.
Back on the bottom end, we can bolt up the oil pump. Now we went with a standard volume since we don't need the extra volume you need in a high performance application. We got the pump, the pickup, and the pan from O'Reilly Auto Parts. Now we can't put the pan on until the front timing cover is in place, and that's part of this week's budget tip. So stick around because we're gonna have that tip and a trip to the engine dyno room right when we get back.
Build on a budget. Horsepower projects that save you time and money.
Delivery, horsepower. Our low-budget big block build all started with a Junkyard 460 Ford motor we disassembled for some machining on the block, heads, and crankshaft. Then we loaded it with factory replacement pistons hanging on refurbished stock rods. We replaced the springs for taller, stiffer ones from Comp and installed one of their hydraulic flat tappet cams. After a basic timing chain setup, we dropped in the rest of our valve train components and buttoned up the top end with a new aluminum intake. Then, to save a few bucks, we upgraded the stock distributor and bolted up a parts store replacement oil pump and pickup. To pinch your pennies on a budget bill, you got to reuse as many original parts as possible, and for us that means things like this timing cover, even water neck, and since we like the looks of these old valve covers, well, they're on the list too. That is after we show you how to bring them back to almost new condition, starting with getting rid of this old gasket material. Then we use solvent and lots of elbow grease to get rid of the caked on oil and dirt. After 30 minutes of this, your arm may be numb, but keep thinking about all the money you're saving.
Man, for such an old valve cover, these things are still in pretty good shape. They do need a little work though. Over the years, they were most likely used with only a cork gasket. What ends up happening is the area around the bolt hole gets pulled down, and that adds up to a leaky gasket around the rest of the rail. So I'm gonna use this hammer and dolly to get them back into shape. With the dolly on the top of the rail, I'll tap the bottom side to flatten them out. While we're here, a little facelift won't hurt either. We're using Dupli-Color high heat ceramic paint with an aluminum finish. More Ford blue for the timing cover. Finally, we knock in a new seal and it's ready to go back on the motor. Unlike aftermarket crankshafts that are mostly all internally balanced, our 460 crankshaft is externally balanced. So we got to run this counterweight on the front of the crankshaft. Now make sure when you do your teardown to keep track of this piece because they're really hard to come by. We're dumping our 460's exhaust into some headers we got from Flowtech. The pipes measure 1 3/4 inches and feed into a 3-inch collector.
Summit Racing's just come out with a new street strip carburetor that's perfect for this project. They got 3 versions. We got the 750 CFM version with a manual choke and mechanical secondaries, and at $330, it sure fit our budget.
Yeah, and they use a tumble polishing process that makes it look a lot more expensive than it really is. Now let's see if she'll run. I don't know about you guys, but there's nothing like the sound of a big mutt going through a set of Super 40s. This thing sounds awesome. Ready?
Just for reference, factory 460s after 79, like ours, had a horsepower rating of 215.
447 foot-pounds, 348 horse.
That's still 130 over stock. Now let's find the rest.
.472 foot-pounds, 366 horsepower.
Okay,
Getting a lot better. Yeah. It's liking the timing. It is loving it. Man, for a motor that was a dog back in the day, this thing's making 493 foot-pounds at 3,400, 378 horsepower at 4,700 RPM.
Hey, I'm pretty happy, and we only spent a shade over $2,300. That's pretty low budget. Well, we got to go, but we're going to keep playing. We'll see you next time with a special engine builder challenge. You want to try to beat that?
Yeah, let's try it.